Hollywood's golden age was built on perfect smiles, glamorous premieres, and stars who seemed larger than life. But behind the bright lights, expensive costumes, and carefully controlled studio images, many famous actors were fighting battles the public never saw. Some endured devastating illnesses for years. Others faced loneliness, addiction, heartbreak, or the slow decline of their health while continuing to perform for millions. They smiled for the cameras, delivered unforgettable performances, and kept their pain hidden from the world. Today, we look at 15 Golden Age Hollywood actors who suffered silently before their tragic final days. John Wayne. To millions of moviegoers, John Wayne was the ultimate symbol of strength. For decades, he played fearless cowboys, soldiers, and larger-than-life heroes who never seemed afraid of anything. His deep voice, powerful presence, and unmistakable walk made him one of the biggest stars of Golden Age Hollywood. But behind that tough image, Wayne faced a devastating health battle. In 1964, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Doctors removed one of his lungs, but Wayne refused to let the illness destroy his career. He returned to work and continued making films, determined to remain the strong figure audiences had always known. But his health continued to deteriorate. For years, the actor endured serious medical problems while continuing to appear in public and work whenever he could. In his final years, the man who had spent his entire career portraying unstoppable heroes was privately fighting a battle his body could no longer win. John Wayne died in 1979 at the age of 72. To the world, he remained the legendary cowboy who never backed down. But behind the famous image was a man who had spent years facing a painful decline, while millions continued to see only the hero on the screen. Clark Gable. For decades, Clark Gable was known as the King of Hollywood. With his confident smile, unmistakable charm, and powerful screen presence, Gable became one of the biggest stars of the Golden Age. He was the kind of actor who seemed impossible to break. But behind the glamorous image, Gable endured years of personal pain. The death of his beloved wife, Carole Lombard, in a plane crash in 1942 devastated him. Those close to Gable said the tragedy changed him deeply. He continued working, but the carefree charm that had once defined him was never quite the same. Years later, his health began to decline. Gable suffered from serious heart problems, yet he continued working and maintained the image of strength that audiences expected from him. His final film, The Misfits, was physically demanding and emotionally exhausting. Not long after completing it, Gable suffered a heart attack. He died in 1960 at the age of 59. The man Hollywood had called its king was gone. But behind the legendary smile was a man who had carried deep personal grief for years, and whose final chapter ended far earlier than anyone expected. James Stewart. For generations, James Stewart represented the kind-hearted hero of Hollywood. With his gentle voice, awkward charm, and unforgettable performances, he became one of the most beloved actors of the Golden Age. But behind that warm image, Stewart experienced some of the most painful losses imaginable. During World War II, he served as a bomber pilot and flew dangerous missions over Europe. The experience left a lasting impact on him. After the war, he returned to Hollywood, but the memories of combat and the loss of fellow airmen stayed with him. Later in life, Stewart faced another devastating blow when his beloved wife, Gloria, died after a long battle with cancer. Her death deeply affected him, and those close to him described the loss as something he never truly recovered from. Although he continued appearing in public, his health gradually declined. James Stewart died in 1997 at the age of 89. The world remembered his movies, his gentle smile, and his unforgettable voice. But behind the beloved Hollywood image was a man who had spent decades carrying the weight of war, grief, and personal loss in silence. Humphrey Bogart. To audiences around the world, Humphrey Bogart was the definition of a tough Hollywood hero. As Rick Blaine in Casablanca and countless other iconic films, Bogart became famous for his sharp dialogue, calm confidence, and unforgettable screen presence. He looked like the kind of man who could survive anything. But behind the tough image, Bogart was quietly fighting a devastating illness. In the late 1950s, he was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus. Even as his health deteriorated, Bogart reportedly tried to maintain his dignity and independence. He continued to fight the disease while the public remained largely unaware of how serious his condition had become. The actor who had spent his career playing men who never surrendered was now facing an enemy he could not defeat with courage or clever words. His condition eventually became critical. Humphrey Bogart died in 1957 at just 57 years old. Millions remembered him as the cool, fearless star of Hollywood's greatest films. But behind the legendary image was a man who had endured a private and painful battle with cancer, one that ended the life of one of the most unforgettable actors ever to appear on the silver screen. Gary Cooper. For decades, Gary Cooper represented the quiet strength of Golden Age Hollywood. He became famous for playing calm, honorable men who rarely needed to raise their voices to command attention. From High Noon to Sergeant York, Cooper built an image of courage and dignity that made him one of the most respected stars of his generation. But in his final years, the actor was facing a devastating battle away from the cameras. Cooper was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 1960. At first, the news was kept private. He continued to appear in public and maintained his familiar image of strength, even as the illness gradually spread. Eventually, his condition became much more serious. Friends and family watched as the legendary actor's health declined. Yet Cooper remained known for his quiet dignity, refusing to let the public see him as anything other than the strong figure they had admired for decades. Gary Cooper died in 1961 at the age of 60. The world mourned the loss of one of Hollywood's greatest leading men. But behind the calm smile and heroic image was a man who had spent his final years quietly fighting a devastating illness, one that he had kept largely hidden from the public until the very end. Spencer Tracy. For decades, Spencer Tracy was considered one of the greatest actors in Hollywood history. He was famous for his powerful performances, sharp intelligence, and ability to make even the simplest line feel unforgettable. But behind the confident actor audiences saw on screen, Tracy struggled with serious personal problems for much of his adult life. He battled alcoholism, and those close to him knew that his private life was often filled with emotional turmoil. Despite his struggles, Tracy continued working and delivered some of the most respected performances of his career. But his health eventually began to fail. In his later years, Tracy suffered from serious heart problems and other health complications. He became increasingly frail, yet continued to work whenever possible. His final days were spent away from the public spotlight. In 1967, Spencer Tracy died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 67. The world remembered the brilliant actor who had made millions laugh, cry, and think. But behind the genius of his performances was a deeply troubled man who had spent years battling addiction, emotional pain, and declining health, often far away from the cameras that made him famous. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum was never the typical Hollywood leading man. With his sleepy eyes, deep voice, and dangerous screen presence, he became one of the most unforgettable actors of the Golden Age. He often played tough, troubled, and mysterious characters, and in many ways, his real life was just as complicated. Mitchum struggled with depression throughout his life. He was also known for heavy drinking and a difficult personal life. Behind his relaxed public image was a man who often battled inner demons that the audience rarely saw. Yet Mitchum continued working for decades. Even as age and health problems began to catch up with him, he maintained his tough image and continued appearing on screen. In the early 1990s, Mitchum was diagnosed with lung cancer. The disease eventually spread, and his health deteriorated rapidly. Robert Mitchum died in 1997 at the age of 79. The world remembered him as one of Hollywood's coolest and toughest stars. But behind the effortless confidence was a man who had spent much of his life struggling with private pain, addiction, depression, and ultimately a devastating illness that brought his long career to an end. Their stories remind us that fame does not make anyone immune to suffering. Behind every legendary performance was a real human being, with fears, struggles, and pain that often remained hidden until the very end. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but their stories, and their legacies, will never be forgotten.